Hello audience, Mr. Z here. Today we're talking about Huey Long, the Kingfish, the former governor of Louisiana and member of the United States Senate from 1932 until his assassination in 1935. Long was an outspoken Democrat and populist who was rising to prominence in the years leading up to his assassination, so much so that he was perceived as a serious potential contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. His followers were absolutely enamored by him. He'd often have an entourage of at least 4 to 8 men, each well armed and prepared to defend him at a moment's notice, except of course the day he, died. Long came to believe that Roosevelt's New Deal was plainly too inefficient to remedy the economic hardships the nation was currently going through, and so proposed a radical new idea for which he gained even more attention. The Share Our Wealth program, which would set a limit on how much a single individual may possess, that being no greater than 300 times the average family income, inheritance and incomes would be capped, while redistribution of wealth was established so that every family could obtain a guaranteed allowance of at least $2,000. This program sought to make, quote, every man a king. Everyone would be insured a car, a radio, and a home valued at $5,000, which may not seem like too much today, but certainly was more back then. Now, it's important to point out that things under Long weren't all red sticks and smiles. Long had an almost frightening authority over Louisiana, drafting and pressing bills through the state legislature despite not having the official authority to do so, but managed to pull it off on account of the nation's frail state at the time and the influence of his allies in Louisiana, whilst reorganizing the state governing structure to bolster his influence while curtailing that of his opponents, who would come to refer to his time in office as the Long Dictatorship. Pair this with his enormous armed following, and it's not hard to see how such an image could emerge. Long no doubt made serious improvements to the lives of the Louisiana people, but he also certainly did so at a serious cost, sort of like Putin. But I think we've gotten enough background out of the way, so without further ado, let's get right into the scenario. September 8th, 1935, Long was president of the Louisiana state capitol attempting to oust another longtime political opponent, Judge Pavey, from his seat. This would be roughly a month after announcing his candidacy for president, drawing even further attention to himself, particularly the eye of Judge Pavey's son-in-law, Carl Weiss, who would, as Long was leaving the House of Representatives, raise a small revolver and shoot Long in the right side. Long's bodyguards were just seconds short of saving his life, but retaliated by shooting Weiss 61 times. Let's say, for the sake of this scenario, that Long's bodyguards managed to subdue his assassin before the fatal shot is fired, and Long goes on to continue his political career, soon becoming the frontrunner for the 1936 election, outshining FDR as the Democratic nominee and going on to win every state but Vermont and Maine. And for those of you who believe a Southerner wouldn't have been able to win a presidential nomination in 1936, it's also important to note that Long also detailed another plan in which he would split the Democratic Party along New Dealers and share the Wealthers, eventually forming his own party and utilizing his right-wing ties to split the Republicans and form a massive party built around the Share the Wealth program. But, to keep this simple, we're going to go with the former, and if all else fails, FDR's polio has to take its toll sooner or later. In either way, it looks like Long's going to be our president into World War II. Since nearly every US president who enters a war gets re-elected for the sake of trusting that president to finish their job. Why is this important? Because Long was a sweet isolationist who would refuse to lend in lease to the Soviets or embargo Japan, which means Japan no longer sees the US as a threat in the Pacific, which means no Pearl Harbor attack, which means the US never enters the war. This also likely means that Britain is forced to capitulate to the Axis while the Soviet Union, without significant aid from the US and Britain, who itself was being subsidized by the Lend-Lease program, would fall to German invasion far easier. Supplies would be scarcer, munitions and weapon production would slow to a crawl, and significant infrastructure like trains and automobiles would be unavailable to transport Russian troops. Turning back to the United States, it's important to acknowledge two important factors: Huey's dictatorial tendencies and the non-existence of a presidential term limit at the time. This, along with the new authoritarian-dominated Europe, could spell something similar in the US to Hitler's ascension from Chancellor to leader of the Reich. Come to think about it, the two nations may end up very similar. Both were in a state of great poverty, only for the people to turn to somebody who could go on to improve infrastructure, repair the economy, and bolster a deep sense of pride in his followers, while also maintaining a strong armed security force. And, though not note for note, Long's policies may have more in common with the socialist aspects of National Socialism, instead of that found in communism or Marxism, as both involve government tightly regulating and directing the affairs of business, whilst profits still fall to the business owner, who can maintain and own their own property, which is not owned by the state. That leads me to believe that Long may pursue not allegiance but cooperation with the German Reich in order to preserve the sovereignty of the United States, something which likely wouldn't be too difficult otherwise, as the steady economic growth of the US would lead it to vastly improve and expand its military, just as Germany did in the 30s. Things in the US are really not too bad. Long, no matter how much power he consolidated for himself, still held the ideal of every man a king deep in his heart and carried it out full force. This likely meant a harsh cracking down on the rich of society for the sake of everyone else, but in the end, you can't expect to make an omelet if you're not willing to crack a few eggs. And that is where I'm going to end the video for now. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.